Uh, all right. Our first session in the afternoon is entitled Women's Histories. And I'll first introduce myself. My name is Huda Zurek. I'm an emeritus professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences at AUB, which means I deal with women's issues from a health perspective. And I hope to hear a little bit, maybe, from Cynthia. I don't know. She has a bit of a background in health. But in any case, we have a panel of 3 people. And our first speaker is Cynthia Kraishati. And she will be speaking about the crisis of presence, oral history, Palestinian women, and the remaking of the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry. Thank you. I first want to say I'm very happy to be here and to be speaking to a room full of scholars who are specialists in oral history and who have done so much tremendous work. So thank you for the organizers for giving me this chance to be here. My presentation today, what I hope I can do is in fact make a kind of a methodological contribution when thinking about how to think through women's histories through the medium and the records of oral histories particularly. And what I'm most interested in and what I'm going to be talking about today is in fact this question of secondary analysis. And I have 2 sets of questions, basically, that kind of orient a bit the presentation that I'm going to be making. The first one is, how do we work with the archive? And more specifically, how do we engage ethnographically with oral history records that come to us from repositories such as the Palestinian Oral History Archive? And if I want to push it even further, I would say, how do we engage ethnographically with the image? That is graphic, mental, verbal, perceptual, etc. So that's the first set of questions. The second is to also think about how in doing that can women's voices, in fact, alter historical records. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the 3 main things I'm going to be sharing with you today. I'm first going to give a brief presentation around the 2 records, the 2 oral history records that I chose to work with. One is an interview that was made by Rosemary Sawyer and that I found on a platform online called Al-Mashriq, maybe some of you in the room are familiar with. And the second one is from the Nakba archive, and it's an interview that was made by an interviewer called Jihad, whom I hope to meet maybe someday if she's not here. So I'm going to be talking about those 2 records. I'm going to then talk a bit about the method that I chose, or what I like to call the particular mode of attunement, which is figuratively but also literally akin to listening. And then the third thing we're going to do is we're just going to listen to an excerpt and watch a very small clip, and then just make a few comments and wrap up. So let me start first by saying that my interests to those records came from thinking about the body from a very phenomenological perspective and actually thinking of the body as a register for experience in a way that does not separate the body from the conception of the self. And that makes the body part and parcel of the subject and also of its formation. And so I was going through things that were made available to me, looking for that very specific thing, and thinking through this question of embodiment in relation to displacement. And that's one of the ways through which I came to select those 2 recordings. So the first one, as I mentioned, was an interview that was made by Professor Rosemary Sawyer on April 12, 1998 in Gaza City, with a woman called Halima Hassouna, who is also known as Faris. And at that time, so at the time of the interview, Faris was actually working in UNRWA, and she had also been evicted from the Shati refugee camp and had spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money to personally build her own home all alone, where she was living with her 2 kids. And in fact, her story, as was made evident by the recording that I listened to, entailed a lot of peripatetic travels. From Gaza, which she had left in 1978 because she had married a freedom fighter, she moved to Baghdad and then traveled back to Gaza, then back to Baghdad, then to Switzerland, then to Damascus, then back to Baghdad, then moved to Saida. From Saida, was evicted in 1991, was forced to move to Badawi camp in the north of Lebanon, and eventually managed to forge some papers that allowed her to go back a widow with her 2 children to Gaza in 1998. And it was around that time that Rosemary Sayegh encounters Faris. And the reason why Faris traveled so much is because she underwent surgery to give birth to her second child in Al Shifa Hospital in Gaza, and then had to suffer through a lot of complications, went through a lot of complications because of this, of the cesarean section that went wrong, and found herself in Baghdad Medical City with a swollen abdomen, a medical team that could not take care of her, and then eventually through the relationship that her husband had, she was flown to Geneva where a medical team took care of her and eventually managed to physically recover. And in the interview, what Faris does is in fact open up and talk about this particular experience. And in the opening lines of the recording, one of the very first things she says, almost as if she was asking for permission from Rosemary Sayegh, she says that I really want to talk about the personal and not the political, is that okay? To which, of course, Rosemary says, yes, it's okay. And then she goes on to tell us her story. Now, the second recording is a video. So the first one is an audio recording only. The second one is a video from the Nakba archive. It's an interview that was made in 2003 by an interviewer called Jihad. I don't have the full information. Sorry? Jihad Idris, thank you, Mahmoud. And it was conducted in Burj al-Barajne. And also, Fatima Shaban, the interviewee, is a magnificent storyteller. The video is now online, and she really has a lot of things to say that are really wonderful, and that it is impossible for me to convey to you the things that she says and the way she expresses them. So if you're interested, I would really encourage you to go and watch that video. But basically, some of the things I would like to share from her story is that Fatima Shaban is from Azib, and she actually fled Palestine on May 14th, 1948, at a time when her daughter was only 9 days old. And her interview, as I mentioned, is very rich. There's a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories, a lot of facts, a lot of songs, a lot of personal reflections, and also personal stories. And some of the stories include like songs that are sung at weddings, all the way to traditional medicinal cures, to even a story of how her own family had bribed a sheikh in Akka in order for him to agree to give her away in marriage at the tender age of 13. And the way she says it is very compelling, because she's very ironic about it, and she's laughing and also mimicking how her family had insisted that she wear high heels and put on makeup to look older. And then there's also a story of how her father-in-law once beat her with a donkey saddle because she was on her way back from the village spring and had dropped the jug and broke it. And while she had thought that this was the reason for the beating, in fact, her father-in-law had explained that that was not the reason why. It was because she did this and then turned back and giggled, and that it was not allowed for women to do that, to smile and giggle. Yeah. So this is a bit of an overview of those two records that I had been working with and thinking through in order to arrive at this proposition that I would like to make in relation to a secondary analysis method and the way through which we can approach the archive and also the image. What I would like to propose is that we can think of an approach to the archive as a form of encounter, that can actually set the stage for a new politics of attunement, of self to the other, which, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, is literally and figuratively akin to a form of listening. And why do I use this idea of listening? For three reasons, I would say. Of course, there are more, but this is what I have so far. One, because there's this idea of voice that I think Diana mentioned yesterday. Voice as something that is embodied, that is unique, that is not only something that is caught in this relationship between signifier and signified, but more so as something that actually structures and precedes language. Second, because there's something about the faculty of listening that is unlike the visual, that makes it very composite, very fragmentary. Whenever we are listening and we are attuned to this particular mode of paying attention to the world, it is very possible to approach the world in a way that is fragmentary, that is gradual. In the case where, if we want to compare this to the visual, I think it takes much more training, let's put it that way, to embrace the visual without its totality. And there is also this capacity for plurality in listening, and then there's this idea that comes to us by way of Edward Said of contrapuntality as well, where there's one voice that we hear, but that in fact is also accompanied by hides and makes way for another. And then the third reason that I want to talk about today as to why listening as a literary and figuratively and also as metaphor, but also as this mode of attunement that I'm talking about is important, and that is the fact that listening can actually allow us to pay attention to silences. And by silences, I'm thinking of those hiatuses or those breaks that occur both in time and in space, and that provide a form of separation or, on the contrary, a form of union between two entities. And in fact, we can even compare this to, if I want to transfer this metaphor to the visual, John Berger has a very, very nice text on the work of Rembrandt, where he talks about a painting of Saint Matthew and the angel, and really just focuses entirely on one particular aspect of the painting, where the angel is whispering something to Saint Matthew. And he goes on to describe at length this space that separates the mouth of the angel from the ear of Saint Matthew's, and calls it the corporeal space. So in talking about silence, I'm also thinking about that space. So that space also resembles silence. Last thing I want to say before we listen to the two very small clips is that I'm also interested in this question of encounter. Why? Of encountering the archive, because encounter entails meeting someone or something unexpectedly. And it's also a form of serendipity, of finding something that is not necessarily what we were looking for. And then there's also this presumption that that an encounter actually entails some kind of a call to action, in the sense that now that you've come across this thing, it's up to you to decide what you want to do with it. So that being said, we're going to listen now to the clip.
ميتة ما في، يعني أنا كويسة هلا، صحتي كويسة الحمد لله. فراح الدكتور، في دكتور اسمه مونتان من أمريكا، هو اللي يعني كان مسؤول عن مجموعة الأطباء اللي قرروا فتحوا بطني، ولما شافوا إنه كل مصاريني مفكك وما فيش ولا مصران مربوط مع الثاني، لأنه الخيطان صرت أنقيها من بطني من برا. معلش تشوفي بطني. واو. هاي كلها عمليات. فوق لفوق. تقريبا للقلب، لعند القلب. هاي كلها بناء على هاي العمليات اللي صارت.
Okay, so this is, you heard an excerpt from Faris talking to Rosemary Sawyer, And I think you paid attention to the silence. And actually, the denial of the visual here is very, very powerful. And I just want to point out one thing, which is in that moment of silence, when I was listening to it, I kind of imagined that Faris had probably reached out to Rosemary and in order to show her her scars. And I hear Rosemary responding with, "It goes all the way up to your heart." And what I thought of it is that, even though Sayegh might have meant it literally in a very organic, anatomical manner, in the way through which abdominal surgeries are very messy and dirty and disfiguring, but actually what Faris's voice really, really carried at that moment in its silence was her heart's own content. We're going to watch now another excerpt, which is from the Poha website, very short. This is the beginning of the interview with Fatima Shaban.
يلا بالبداية برحب فيكي حجة وبعرفك عن اسمي أنا جهاد ونحن فريق من الباحثين المستقلين عم نعمل تسجيل للتاريخ الشفوي الفلسطيني مع الجيل اللي طلع على لبنان ليشكل مرجع للباحثين والأجيال القادمة وعم نعمل هالمقابلة معك لتكون جزء من هالمرجع
يا هلا.
فبالبداية بنحب نتعرف بحضرتك اسمك
فاطمة شعبان جوزت علي أحمد الحج عشت من العمر أنا وياه 55 سنة 55 سنة
مواليد أي سنة حجة؟
أنا عشت أنا وياه 60 سنة مش 55 60 سنة وجبت منه 15 ولد كل ب 14 أيار طلعنا.
بأي سنة خلقانة بفلسطين؟
ما بعرف بقول سنة 20 ما بعرف شايفة يما وسنتها طلعنا.
كم ولد كم أخ كنتوا أنتوا بالبيت؟ كيف كان بيت العيلة؟
أربع بنات.
من أي بلد حجة؟
من الزيب. إحنا من الزيب أضعكا. بدك تقولي يعني قريبين بالبحر مثل ما تقولي إحنا مثل صور بقلب البحر.
وأنت حاليا وين ساكنة؟
كنت بالزيب.
حاليا هون هلا.
هون هدينا برج البراجنة. مخيم برج البراجنة. يعني ما طلعناش ورحنا جينا من فلسطين قعدنا بالباص 10 سنين واجينا لهون بعدنا إنه هون من حرب شمعون بس نزل شمعون قعدنا بهالسهلة جيت عمرت غرفة وقعدت فيها بس هذا ما كان هيك العالم كانت كلها رمل صحراء رمل يعني بدك تقولي حجر صغير هيك تتمنيها ما فيه هذا هون هيك برج البراجنة.
So two things that really struck me in this opening interview were one, the gestures that Fatima Shaban that she does that are very much to me about a form of conjuring a territory that is inside the sea. Azib is like sur, it's inside the sea, and the circle that she draws with her hand is not closed because the sea, of course, provides an openness, and all of us people who have lived by the coast know this too well. The second thing that I found very striking that Freud might call a slip is that in response to the question that Jihad asks her, where do you live now? She responds as Zib. We can think about it in that way, or we can think about it in another way. And I'm thinking here about the quote from Mahmoud Darwish that says that a place is not geography; it is a state of mind. And I really do think that in saying that, Fatima Shaban, for a very fleeting moment, kind of was able to conjure her Azib, and in our encounter with that kind of an archive, perhaps we can do that as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, for your insightful and passionate presentation. I failed to introduce you, so I would like to tell the audience that Cynthia was trained first as a pharmacist, and then she got a Master's of Arts in Sociology from AUB. Now she is currently a PhD student in anthropology at McGill. Our second speaker is Aziz Nusser. And Aziz is an associate professor of international studies and women's and gender studies at Denison University. She received her PhD on women's and gender studies from Clark University. And she has more that you can read in this. So we're giving you a basic introduction. Now, Aziz will speak on generational narratives of displacement of Palestinian women from Syria.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the organizers, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm still conflicted whether to speak in Arabic or in English, so I might be moving in between. We'll see how this works itself out. I'm going to talk briefly about my work. I'm going to use the word continuums a lot because my work itself is a series of projects, oral history projects. The first one was my dissertation project where I worked with Palestinian, is this good? Yeah. With Palestinian women, 3 generations of Palestinian women in the 1948 area. When the American invasion took place, I became very interested in the effect of the war, the invasion on women. I couldn't go to Iraq for security reasons, so I ended up between Jordan and the United States conducting 300 interviews actually with Iraqi women refugees talking about the effect of displacement on their lives. And in 2015, I started the project. I don't think in any of these projects, except maybe my dissertation, because it was about my own life and my relation to my family and generations around me. I started working with Syrian refugees in Germany, and I've been conducting that work since 2015. I've been doing going back and forth between the United States and Germany for the last the first 3 years, and then recently I've been living there for most of this year. Interestingly enough, although the second and the third projects were not necessarily about Palestinians came into these projects without me planning on it. I ended up interviewing actually Palestinians who were forced out of Iraq after the 2003 invasion. I met many of them in Texas and California, and now I have actually oral histories talking about them being Palestinians who grew up after 48 in Iraq and were forced out. Majority of them actually lived in the camps between Jordan and Iraq because Jordan wouldn't let them in, and then they were settled in different countries, including the United States, in the period after 2007 in particular. The work with Syrians in Germany, also I ended up interviewing lots of Palestinians. Many times people would tell me, interview this person. I didn't know they were Syrian, they were Palestinian. But overall, I ended up interviewing people from mostly 3 camps in particular, Yarmouk, Nerab, and Daram. So I'm gonna give you 3 short stories that I think shape some of the questions I'm trying to address in my work with Palestinian. I interview both men and women, although this is gonna focus mostly on the gender because my previous 2 projects I focused only on interviewing women with Syrians and Palestinians from Syria. I've been interviewing men and women. I'm very interested in continuums of violence, narratives of crossing and passage, and also the layers of trauma in there. I'm in particular interested in vulnerabilities and constructions of masculinities and femininities within those narratives. So this is why I'm actually interviewing both. And also in the beginning, I had a harder time reaching women. Now, after spending so much time in the field, I actually, my work is ethnographic. I do also volunteer work. I lived with the family, so it became, after 4 years, a different mode of working with the community. I teach English at Back on Track is a Syrian organization that tries to work in Berlin, but there are similar organizations that work in different parts of Germany. It's about empowering students to get help without necessarily being stigmatized as others or as students who need help. So if a student comes in and says, I want to study Arabic for that Saturday, we're there for 2 hours to teach them Arabic. I mostly teach English, and the other day there were 2 students. I taught them Arabic for the first time because their teacher wasn't there. I asked them, where are you from? And they say, we're from Safad, and they're 9 and 10 years old. So what it means to be from Safad, through Yarmouk, coming into Berlin is something I'm still thinking about. Another interview I did with a woman from Yarmouk as well. She actually took her 3 months to walk, literally, to cross to Turkey from inside Syria. And then cross the Mediterranean and walk for the rest of the road with a 2-year-old and her younger brother. Because what families did is they chose certain members of the family. Many times they couldn't all afford to make the trip to Europe. They were counting on the family unification. So if one member that's below 18 made it, then they could get the parents and the brothers and sisters who are under 18. In this case, this woman's family actually is now divided because her brothers, 2 of her brothers, until the family unification process was completed, they were above 18. They weren't allowed into Germany. They ended up going to Brazil. And actually, I interviewed both this woman and her mother. And I'm going to talk later about what it means to do this work, the different threads that we as people who do oral history research need to take into account in terms of what trauma people carry with them, the embodiment of that trauma on their body, the sickness, and how that gets told in the story. You spoke a bit about that. But this woman was telling me how she was a physics student at the university in Damascus, and she was comparing her life now, being in Germany with another Safadi. They're both from Safad, another Safadi, her closest friend, who stayed in Syria. And what was really interesting about that, you hear about the survival, what it means to make it as a woman. So there's all the gendering of the narratives to Germany with a little kid and a younger brother. But also she was talking about her options, and the way she was constructing the story and sharing it with me, it felt like she in Germany had lesser options to achieve her dream of becoming a physics professor, because now she's very bound to the survival mode of learning a new language, doing the paperwork, bringing her family together, getting her husband to come to Germany, and there's also stigma because the dominant narrative among Syrians and Palestinians is that Germans want us to come clean their streets, take care of their elderly. That's why they allowed us in, and that's. We can talk maybe in the question and answer, where does that come from? But this particular woman, she's learning now to be an assistant nurse in a house for the elderly. So it's really interesting in thinking about, why it was important for her to share these stories, and also what this means through these continuums of displacement. Because when I talked to her mom talked mostly about being sick. When the family, they knew that they could not have 2 brothers be with them. She literally for a year collapsed. Her body just couldn't handle the traumas of displacement, the destruction of their house, etc., but the fact that they couldn't even maintain the minimum of keeping their families together. The third story happened on a bus in Berlin just 2 weeks ago, and I was with a woman I know. She's also from Yarmouk, and she was talking, and she's very extremely sharp, but everything for her comes through a joke. So she was telling us about how she was traveling with 3 of her kids, and in Europe, the bags got heavy, so the kids were just throwing things along the way as they were walking to make things. And then a woman next to us, and we were speaking in Arabic in a bus in Shara al-Arab, for those of you who know Berlin. A woman started laughing, and she said, well, it's the same story with us. And then she started telling us about why she likes living close to that area, because she said otherwise it will be ghurbi ala ghurbi. So it's these layers of displacement that make it really hard for her to live in Berlin. So these are just kind of for you the context of where I'm doing my work and how I'm doing it. And I want to just share some threads and some of the challenges, and hopefully we'll have more time to talk about some of these issues more in detail in the question and answer session. So I want to put it out there as what it means to do this oral history project in a context of that is يعني في غربة. It's a different location. فيش مخيم. The namings are different. The context, how people carry themselves, the meaning of community, the dispersal. So it is doing all of that within this context. There's the issue of language, what it means to learn a new language. For the younger generation, of course, it's easier. What it means for the older generation. Like I mentioned, the divided families, the transgenerational, the intergenerational, the generational connections that we need to take into account as we do this work, but also the embodiment. The embodiment, I work a lot on trauma in my own work, what it means to do to hold the family together. I mean, to hold the community. It's not just about the nuclear family, it's what it means to bring together things that are familiar, to make a certain familiar space, right? And relation to place in a context that's very, and I've done this work in different parts of Germany, and recently I went even to rural areas that I didn't have access as much to at the beginning of my research. And these are, they call them daya, so these are very, very small. There could be 10 families, from Syria or Palestinian, 50 families. I went to a place where it's actually the site of neo-Nazis in Germany. So how do you tackle these? And what kind of recording do you do? How do you work with this? And also, again, what it means to listen, to record, to act in these contexts. Where there's so much dispersal, there's also so much trauma, there's so much violence, there's so much loss, because especially when you talk about narratives of crossing, not everyone made it, right? We also interview people where they lost family members. They either drowned in the Mediterranean, the ones who were left behind because of the circumstances. I mean, we have families now that I'm getting to know more closely where the husband is left behind with 2 children. The woman comes, what it means when we say divided families, right? How are they maintaining contact? What impact does this have on children? What impact does this have on the community? These are not things we can take for granted, and these would require long, right? So when we talk about continuum, you need to do more than one, right? To keep recording and engage with what people are going through and how they're coping. There's also lots of we were talking earlier, resistance, resilience, I don't know what name to give it, but people also are very creative in how they deal with it, and also how they draw on the strength of their communities and what's familiar to them to sustain themselves. For example, one woman, her husband came after they did family unification to Germany. He couldn't handle the stress and went back, or the new situation. He went back, she's now there with 3 children, and I think they are finalizing their divorce, so the effects are continuous within those contexts. So what language, what tools do we need to have to record, read these oral histories? What text and subtext? It's really interesting for me when I do this work, what people tell me, why they tell me this. I am Palestinian, Arabic is my first language, but I also come from different places. I grew up in Nazareth, I live in the United States, now I'm doing these interviews in Germany, and relation to places and spaces are also very interesting, because most of the people I'm interviewing come from Safad, the Safad area, Tabariya, Alubi, Sajara, Antirit, Haifa. These are places I know, and I know them now. And now I know the people who come from these places. So there are continuums also for me as a researcher, and traumas that I carry within that. So these are also important to think about. It's also important to think about the silence. And when we focus on gender analysis in this context, we need to really take into account the body, what the body tells us, what it doesn't tell us, what is kept. For example, one woman said, please keep this off the record, but she talked about the violence that was practiced on her as she was crossing, right, from Syria into Germany. So how do we read those silences, the violence that comes with it, what it means to bear witness, to tell what these testimonies mean in that context, and also to think about these continuums as not fixed. I mentioned earlier how important it is to trace and to also make the overlap, because in my work on narratives or on crossing, I'm very interested in Poha in particular, because I'm trying to get into, when we say people just came to Lebanon, how did they come? Did they walk? What happened? What are these processes? How are they relevant to what people are experiencing now, right? So if we take 48, if we take 67, if we take these narratives of crossing. Where do we put them across these continuums, right? How do these continuums intersect with each other is something I'm trying to look at, because none of this is fixed. And actually in people's narratives, you see how they draw on these different levels of analysis in the narratives and how they tell their stories. And then also how collective this is. I mean, we're here thinking about these issues. I'm also very interested in the communal aspects of telling, of gathering these oral histories, but also of the telling of these histories. And one last thing I want to just put out there, when we think about relation to Palestine, I've been doing this work within a context of Syria. I have to go back and now do more targeted interviews on Palestine, but it's not easy for me to separate, right? Because these are people whose history is also intertwined with being in Syria. And what Yarmouk means to people now is like what their probably parents, what Zib or Safad in this context means to their parents or grandparents. So it's interesting also to take those layers. Although I met lots of younger people, and when we're talking and say, I'm going. They're very curious, what is Palestine, where is Palestine? They know, they read. The internet is a great access. Of course, histories of their families are very familiar to them, but it remains an idea. And sometimes it's so abstract that it's really hard for us to talk about it. It's very different with the younger generation, with the older generation, because they can talk about stories that they heard from their parents, and it's more vivid and it's more tangible in that context. So, freedom of movement, if we talk about the context of them being in Germany now, I mean, for some, when they get their papers sorted out, which is really complicated and will take a very long time, they will probably be able to visit. Visit, what does it mean? What kind of relation? And what kind of context do we need to keep tracing as we collect these narratives and work with them? Thank you.
Thank you, Aziz, for taking us to Germany and the new migration that is happening and what you call the double refugee, people going from Palestine to Syria and then from Syria to Germany, where it's not only a geographic move, but also a cultural move and all the diversity that we have to be aware of in this experience. Thank you very much. Our third speaker is the topic of her talk is storytelling and reimagining. Sorry, Dima. This is by Dima Qaid Bey. It is storytelling and reimagining feminist movements in Lebanon. And Dima has a PhD in women, gender, and sexuality studies from Ohio State University. She is currently a consultant at the Arab Council for Social Sciences and the co-founder and the managing partner of the feminist organization in Beirut, the Knowledge Workshop. تفضل إريما.
Thank you, Huda. I have to say it's very special for me to be present here at this conference and to have been a witness to the long-awaited launching of the Palestinian Oral History Archive. So mabruk to Kawkab, Hana, and everyone involved. I don't work with Poha and nor with with Palestinian life histories generally, but I think the reason I was invited here was because of my work with and in the Knowledge Workshop, which is building a feminist archive. And I think this is what we share with Poha, is that feminist sensibility and approach to our work. And I think because there are interesting similar issues, but also the similarities that are productive to have a conversation around. So today what I will be sharing with you is some of my reflections on my work of building a feminist archive, mainly through women's oral histories at the Knowledge Workshop, or ورشة المعارف بالعربي. The Knowledge Workshop, or hereafter I will refer to it as KW, is a feminist organization that came into being in 2015, but we officially launched it in 2016. But it had been years in the making before that. There's no way to talk about KW without talking about our experiences and our involvement with the feminist collective Sawt al-Niswa since 2009. So we usually say KW is a continuation, expansion, and institutionalization of our work in the collective. And that passion and obsession with documenting, with women's life histories, especially with feminist history, it started in Sawt al-Niswa in at least 2009. In Sawt al-Niswa as well, most of what we talked about as a collective was the importance of movement building and of an intergenerational feminist movement. And when I say we, I include all the feminists who have ever been part of Sawt al-Niswa. But I also want to mention specifically my colleague Sara Abu Ghazal, a Palestinian feminist based in Beirut who founded Sawt al-Niswa. And she and I would later go on to establish and manage and co-manage KW. And Sarah is also right now doing a series of interviews with Palestinian women activists in Lebanon and with Palestinian women who have played some kind of public role in their communities. So KW doesn't only focus on oral history. We have a public feminist library. We give grassroots sort of classes on issues from a feminist perspective. And there are different projects we work on that are aligned with movement building, with making knowledge accessible, with changing conceptions about what is considered legitimate knowledge and whose knowledge and whose narratives are worth preserving and disseminating. But in terms of the oral history project, which is called the Storytellers Project, KW's aim is to construct an archive of the feminist movement in Lebanon, of women's involvement in activism in various social movements across the country, while also, of course, looking at women's personal lives and the personal choices that they make and how their gender shapes these choices. So the questions we usually ask in a typical interview starts from their childhood, the first memory they ever had, the narrator's first home, the family and friends, the village or wherever they came from, the social rituals they participated in, whether religious or secular. We go into school, education. If they're not from Lebanon, we ask them about their lives before Lebanon, or if they're not from Lebanon, or if they were not born here. The first time they came here, their first impression. In many cases, women activists start their political participation sort of during their school days. So we ask them about the first protest they participated in and how their families reacted to that. And after that, the interview goes on to talk about different periods of their activism and of their lives. And to note, right now we are focusing on women activists and women in the public sphere. In the future, I think, and I'm pretty sure there will be oral histories with women who are not, publicly engaged. But at the moment, I see this is where we are able and we are contributing to the feminist movement by having this archive of feminist activists. And there are two main points that I will be expanding on today. First, the intergenerational aspect of the feminist archive. But I also want to talk about how an inclusive feminist archive that we're building sort of drastically changes how the movement is read. And the inclusivity of it also impacts how we archive and what kind of stories can be publicly heard. And I will talk about how the stories of women who have been marginalized because of what is considered non-normative gender and sexuality is great, and also because of ethnicity and the precarious position they are in, brings up very distinct set of issues and challenges. In terms of the intergenerational relations, I have spoken about this probably in every platform I am given, but I think today I'm going to personalize it way more. So for some time now, for maybe 10 years, at least in 10 years since my involvement in Sawt al-Niswa, if not before, I've really felt this generational rupture. The spaces we were in didn't have older feminists, maybe like older than 30 at that time. In addition to that physical absence, there was also the absence of stories of the women who came before us, and especially of women, of feminists that reflected our lives and our politics, and the lives and politics of a lot of the feminists around me. Whether they were not all Lebanese, they were not all maybe middle class, not all from Beirut, they were not all heterosexual maybe, or had different gender identities. If they were heterosexual, they were concerned with changing and shifting their intimate relationships with the significant others, or the way they do relationships. So given this disconnection, it was easy to fall into thinking that we were doing and saying things for the first time. It was also easy to assume, for a short while, that we were creating the movement. And in South Niswa, we started actively looking for these older stories and providing our own feminist interpretations of what we found. And we did that mostly through writing, eventually through podcasting on Radio South. But when Sarah Abu Ghazal and I first began drawing the vision and the plan for KW, so one of the aims of starting the Oral History Project and having that project be our primary, one of the primary projects, was to address this disconnect in particular. But I also think, to personalize it again, that it's worth mentioning that today, 10, 13, 15 years later, after what I see or what I think of as the start of the young feminist movement today, the conversation is also shifting a bit. We are not the young ones anymore. There's a whole new generation of 18, 20-year-olds coming to these spaces. And so we've sort of become this bridge. We're not the older feminists yet, and we're not the younger feminists anymore. And we've had the chance to interact with both generations. And honestly, I think I needed to be in this position generationally, this middle position. And I think this middle position stretches to feminists and activists in 30s and 40s. Because as fascinated and obsessed as I have been with feminist histories and women's histories for many, many years now, I think it is only recently that I'm able to sit with and listen to the full complexity of women's lives. I think when I was younger, I was looking for more polished narratives that iterated or demonstrated the purest, most radical aspects of women's organizing. And so today, I think I can better be able to listen to, or I like the word attuned to, the contradictions, and I can even say the flaws in our lives, in our politics. Even though it's still hard, I'm more able to listen to women who are, on the one hand, amazing activists in whatever cause they are fighting for, but also, on the other hand, be complicit in some ways with a patriarchal system, with a racist kafala system, or have some sort of internalized biases based on socioeconomic class. And so it is through doing oral history that we have started to pay attention to listening as an important feminist value and practice, as much as speaking your own story and having that story matter is an important, feminist, feminist cause or issue. So to go into more details of the oral history process, the practical way we've chosen to do our work is to focus on themes. So every year we have at least one theme that we choose, and we do a series of interviews within it. So we've had themes like women in the environmental movement, women in the 2015 Hirak, during the garbage crisis. We're just starting a trans oral history project that I will be talking about shway more in a bit. And within each theme, we have been intentional in including women from multiple generations, from multiple ethnic backgrounds and political experiences. So what emerges when we have this intergenerational approach? I think what we find out is that, of course, there are changes in the discourse, some changes in the priorities, but it is too simplistic to say the movement used to be this way, now it's another way, or that younger feminists can be described one way and that older feminists thought and acted and organized differently. That was most clear to me when we were doing oral histories with feminists who were part of the Hirak in the summer 2015 around the garbage crisis. So we interviewed feminists who took part in these protests. And if you look at this series of interviews alone, you will see that everyone condemned state violence toward protesters, but the younger feminists were more sympathetic to protesters who were throwing things at the police or at windows of establishments downtown Beirut. So they understood the motivation and frustration and anger around it, and they spoke about it. Older feminists, however, were a bit more cautious about such aggression, or a bit more skeptical about it, aggression towards the state. And I knew why, and the people I interviewed who talked about this knew why. Some of them articulated it, that older feminists remembered the Civil War and lived through militia rule and all that. So, for example, one younger feminist told me during the interview that the anger of the protesters was rightful. Like, I remember her saying, "Le Gray will survive, it's fine." And she went on to say, I understand why older feminists, older people in general, may not be as enthusiastic because they've seen their country destroyed and now the country sort of looks a bit normal, so I understand where they're coming from. So if you just focus on this series of interviews, what you might conclude is that younger feminists are okay with aggression or confrontation with the state. Older feminists are not. If you look at the bigger archive, you will see, for example, there are people who have participated in protests, 60s, 70s, 80s, who were always pro-peaceful protest. Then you have, for example, somebody like Dalal Bizri's oral history, where she talks about how she used to enjoy these confrontations when she was younger. And she would say something, "شو ما تعطي أنا رشق السلطة كنت كتير أتحمس." Go on to talk about and narrate the story of how the police were hitting her, she was hitting back, and she ended up in jail. And it's a really fascinating oral history. She's a wonderful storyteller. If you find, you can find that narrative on our website. So this is just one example of how an intergenerational archive will allow us to see all the diverse strategies and ways of organizing that are applied today have their own different histories, and all these histories are there, although some are more visible than others. And it's also productive to look at recurrent themes. For example, one recurring theme is gendered relations in mixed spaces. People who organized in the 70s talked about it, people who organized in 2015 talked about it. And so I see that, with creating this archive, some sort of, with this, archiving these stories is the process of also building the movement and the history of that movement. And, in that process as well, the aim, the hope is that we're also expanding what the feminist movement looks like. Who is considered feminist. So as much as it is, for example, and most young feminists especially know this, that the activism of domestic migrant workers is an integral part of the feminist movement, and it has shaped us, shaped the scene. But we're also hoping with this archive that the organizing of migrant workers in the 90s, in the early 21st century, when that was not visible, becomes part of the feminist history, that there's no way to talk about feminist history, for example, in the 90s without talking about such organizing. I have a small amount of time yet, and I think I want to talk about what working on oral histories of trans people, and this is what we're currently working on, oral histories of trans women, sort of, puts forward a very particular set of challenges. When we were doing the interviews, without any initiation from us, the woman asked that their oral histories are published not in audio form, but as written form. And so they asked us that we put that in the consent form. And a lot of them could not talk about their childhood. A lot of them were abandoned, had, bad relationship with their families. They could not talk a lot about their communities because already they move in such close spaces. So it's very interesting to see how marginalization and oppression fragments your story and makes you unable to fully tell all of the story or tell it in both oral, or of course not in any in a video, for example. In some way, we saw the same with migrant workers, especially after the set of deportation of community leaders in migrant communities that, at best, they could not tell their full names, but in most cases, they also could not tell everything, they could not publish all their stories. And we have, in our oral histories, we have the option of people keeping their oral histories confidential. But I mean, that shows you what we can say, and when is the right time for people to be able to accept, to listen to these oral histories. And yeah, I hope that we'll start some conversations today, so thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dima, for your wide attempt to look at women and women's histories and feminists. I wonder when you get into the older generation and the younger generation and the youngest generation, how people deal with this definition or identification. This would be interesting to find out. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. And now we can open the floor for a discussion. And maybe this could be one of the questions when your time comes. We open for discussion, questions, comments. Yeah, people need somebody to encourage them. Can I ask my own question? Because I was listening to you. I was wondering, you were speaking about feminists, and I know if you move to an older generation, a younger generation, the perspectives are different. Can you say a few things about that?
You mean identifying as feminists?
Yes, identifying, understanding themselves as feminists.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, you could say I'm for women.
Yeah.
But I mean the term feminists is changing. I think in
Yeah.
terms of people's
Right.
perception. Some people wouldn't say.
Yeah, and I think this is another place where
How do you encounter that? How do you feel that?
Yeah. This is another place where it's not so easy to say younger feminists quickly and easily adopt the label feminist, or certain ways to be feminist, and older feminists are different. As much as there are younger feminists who, for different reasons, are not comfortable with the term, there are also older feminists, and in people's life they change at some point. They don't know the term, they think it implies certain things, and then maybe they adopt it. But for me, what I think about it in terms of archive is not whether women adopt the label feminist or not. It's mainly, to build a feminist archive, it's what we who call ourselves feminists need to look at in terms of women who may have different political beliefs, may have very different lives, but they've contributed in some ways to women in public space, to activism. So this is my approach to it.
Okay, we can talk about it. Okay. Any questions? Yes, please. Nina. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Okay. It's actually similar to your question, but the way I'm going to ask it is, do you operationalize feminism, right? What is your operational definition of feminism and feminists, you know, if you have a specific criteria that you follow in terms of that specificity? And also, I was wondering, so just because you are, it's related also to this, to the first point, because you are focused on feminists, but you are also only focusing on women, because there are a lot of male feminists, you know, who identify as feminists. I was wondering if you do any work with male feminists, which is related to the first point, which is operationalizing feminism. Thank you.
Do we take a set of questions? Want to take a set of questions first?
Oh, okay. Oh, now we're having, thank you. Okay, now let us start. We have 1, 2, 3 in the back, but can you introduce yourselves? Never mind, you have the mic, so
Okay.
stand up, but introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Rama. I just wanted to ask Dima because, like, feminism to have an activism around feminism is really hard, and I wanted to ask, how do you contextualize Western forms of feminist knowledge into the Middle East in your work or in Warshat al-Ma'arif work? And I know there's a lot of feminist scholars are trying to oppose Western form of knowledge, like Layla Bulughud, like doing a book called like Do Muslim Women Need Saving? So how do you approach Western forms of knowledge? And in terms of generational gaps, also there is what feminists, like Western feminists, call like this first wave, second wave, third wave, and all of that.
So let's have a particular question, not a whole series of questions, okay?
Yeah.
What's your one question?
That was my one question, is Western forms of knowledge, and how do you contextualize that to the Middle East?
Okay.
And like for example, the waves as form of knowledge too.
Thank you. Now we have 2 more questions. Are they to Dina, or are your questions to Dima also?
No, my question is to Cynthia.
Okay, تفضلي.
So I was just thinking that the first interview is audio, and then the second interview is both audio and video. And now Dima also kind of presented a third form, which is text, because that was the wish of the subject. And I'm just wondering, thinking about listening and attunement and a secondary encounter, if the encounter is with the subject or with the medium itself as well. I felt like when you said that, because we don't have access to the visual, that was really powerful, and it was. And I'm wondering if, listening changes with the change of the form of the oral history.
Okay, one more question. Do we have?
Hello, my name is Riem. My question is to Assis. I was kind of thinking about when you were talking about silence and how that fits in and how that tells a story within itself, like choosing not to speak. That kind of reminds me of how stories from my grandmother they would be like very detailed on very small things, but they would kind of hide the bigger picture and the horrible stories that happened. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how does silence fit into oral history?
Would you like to take more questions, or shall we just give you the chance to? كوكب, تفضلي كوكب.
Hi, my question is also for Cynthia. You were talking about thinking about this ethnographically, and we oftentimes do this kind of self-reflection. So I wanted to switch the kind of perspective and think about Rosemary's voice for a second, and the voice of the interviewer, and because in a sense with the archive in general, that interviewer's life is also on display. And so it's really maybe not so much of a question as a kind of comment in terms of how do we work with that voice. And I mean, I've been reluctant to share audio that I have, for example, because my life is also on display. And what happens when the interviewer is Palestinian, for example, and then sharing their life back and forth in order to actually get information, you have to divulge information. So just thinking about the interviewer as well.
كوكب.
Okay, just a quick question. I think it's a question for both Dima and Isis, and it has to do with the planning of the archive and how you label it and how you present it as you're conducting the interviews. So for Dima, does this affect the way you recruit people? Do people feel like they can say certain things but not others because of the way you're presenting your archive? And the second part of the question for Isis is if you could comment a little bit about the planning regarding the long-term access for interviews and testimonies around human rights conflict, live issues, things that are very timely. Thank you.
Okay. We'll go this way.
Okay. Thank you, Razan, for your very difficult question. I would provide an answer on two levels. First to answer your question, I definitely think that the encounter is both with the subject and the medium itself, and for two reasons. One, because there's a certain materiality that is inherent to the medium that makes it very specific, in the sense that a photograph is not the same as a poem, not the same as installation, not the same as an audio recording, etc. And then the second is also because, this is going to sound very weird, so I'm going to use maybe a quote from Benjamin to better illustrate my point. In his short essay about him unpacking his library, he talks about how he lives in his books, like part of him lives in his library. So I also think there is something in the medium that actually comes out through that. And I like to think that in the case of the oral history encounter, there is both bits and pieces of the interviewer and also the interviewee. And I think that's a nice transition to your question. Also, thank you for asking it. Definitely, I think that in secondary analysis, and this is something I did not mention here, but that I've also been thinking about, it is as important, it's as important to think about the interviewer as well, because there are things that have been said through the oral history interview that have only been made possible because two people came together at a certain moment of time in a particular place. And so there's something about this occasion that is very specific that I think should also come across in any attempt to analyze that. So
maybe I'll follow up on that. I actually don't index and I don't categorize. And for me, every interview is a world on its own, and I relate to it. And I write the interviews. I don't record and I don't audio tape. And probably it started when I did my work with Palestinian women, and especially with the older generation, those who lived under military administration rule. The minute you record something, that's it, you're out of the door. So maybe that's a skill I developed. And the pen becomes, because I can maintain eye contact and I write, it's a different kind of communication, because each interview, there's a lot happening all at once, and people are telling you and not telling you. There's the silence, the body language, and at times, everything has to be very quick. I write if a person smiled, I write these things. I write reactions after, but it's a very, very complicated process. And I find actually it becomes, for me, at least in the way I work, it's like another form of violence to come and chop and categorize. But that's my own maybe bias, because I like the interview to be a world on its own. And when I read them and I take the pieces that I think are relevant to whatever I'm trying to analyze and write about, there's always also, what do you keep? We can't do huge chunks, but at least you try to do justice because people trusted you with these. And these are big responsibilities. And I talked about trauma. People carry trauma, they transfer it to you. You carry traumas. They carry traumas. How do these communicate? And actually, why do people trust you with certain things? What it means to be a woman researcher. I don't mean to be essentialist or reductionist in this. What it means to have done research with other communities about some of those topics. How does this play itself out in the kind of narratives people share with you, because they are constructing a certain story. And maybe if you come the second day, they might tell you the same story, but not necessarily in the same way or not with the same details. For silences tell as much as words in the work we do, and especially when you talk about violence, about gendered violence, about violence, growing up, about displacement, about loss, about pain. How do you express these? Where are the moments? Where are the ahas? Where are people really thinking? And do you really allow that space during the interview for people? Because, yesterday during the presentation, you said the interview could be half an hour. It could be mine, where from half an hour to 6 hours. I mean, that's the range. And you can't dictate, and you really have to work with those. But these are hard, and actually after hearing, because there are times when I say, I wish I recorded when someone is reciting poetry, I can't write it, so there are choices we make as researchers. We can't do everything, but it's really important for us, and what I try to emphasize in my presentation, these continuums, what it means to do these kinds of projects in these different locations, but how they intersect with each other, and what methodologies we need to maybe think about collectively as well and not individually, because what might work for one at a certain moment might not necessarily work at others for the same researcher even.
Did you want to answer Kaukab's question, or did you answer?
I did.
Sorry. Excuse me.
I hope.
For the definition of feminists, again, I would define it as people who have certain political consciousness, awareness of gendered relations within a system, as it maybe interconnects with other systems. I understand that, not all feminists, what I would define a feminist, I'm not going to be apologetic about it, is, people who look around not just, patriarchal issues, but issues of class and race and, the capitalist system and all that. But, the reason I say I'm not apologetic about it is that, I have my own definition of feminism and feminist, but also, for the purpose of an archive and understanding the diversity of political, backgrounds and opinions. The people we include, and I think, this is what I told Huda, is not just people who identify as feminists or a particular kind of feminist, but people who challenge certain gendered norms, especially women. And we only, I understand that there are men who define themselves as feminists, and there are allies, but the KW's archive is, at the time being, only women, genderqueer people, trans people as well. So women who challenge certain gendered relations, who are part of, community organizing in their context. Does that answer your questions? Yeah. To talk about, when Kaukab was asking about if people, say particular things and not others when you're presenting yourself, I remembered this one narrator, I was asking her questions about her life, about her family, and she kept saying, and she told me afterwards, I wasn't oppressed, why are you asking me about my family? I wasn't oppressed. You know, we lived in very, like my parents treated us, girls and boys, you know, the same. And in some ways, I think what she was assuming is that I'm asking these questions as a feminist because I want to show how oppressed all women are. And I had to tell her, I mean, you know, we're not looking for the scandalous victimization of, you know, all these stories, blacks, and also, you know, people who are able to be in certain spaces and mobilize freely more often than not have come from, you know, families that have allowed them in some ways in certain, you know, certain times of their period to be, certain periods of their lives to have access to these spaces and education, all that. And a lot of the times, this was one story where I hadn't met with the woman before, and so she didn't know, you know, where I was coming from. Most of the times, I do sit with the woman before, especially when it's older women, older activists and feminists. They are curious. They ask all the questions they want to ask about the younger feminist movement and what feminism means to me and to us and how it was different for them. So in some ways, these assumptions are worked out before we go into the interview. To talk about, I mean, it's a very big conversation to have about Western feminism. On the one hand, you know, we are building an archive ground up, and I don't think when I go and do oral histories, personally, I'm thinking of, you know, what Western feminists say and all that. But on the other hand, I mean, there's the reality. I have been influenced by feminists coming, for example, from the US. Personally, I've been influenced by women of color, feminists of color in the US rather than, for example, mainstream white women. And a lot of the feminists around me have been influenced by some kind of Western or non-Western in the US or Europe or other parts of the world movements. So, I mean, there's also no way to totally separate, but it's a conversation to be had about Western feminism and you know, the context of Lebanon. In terms of the waves, I mean, I know there are a few people who have sort of thought of the feminist movement in Lebanon as waves, and it's legitimate. It makes sense. It's one way to categorize and think, and you know, be able to, for example, teach and talk about the feminist movement. For me, if you think about it in a clear set of waves, I think, you know, again, I've been influenced, for example, by indigenous feminism, and that's where, you know, you think about cycles and patterns and nonlinearity. So I don't describe it, or I don't think of it as waves, but you can think of it in terms of a timeline. I mean, there are different ways to think about it. But, you know, I hope you find me after this panel and we can talk about it more.
Thank you. We have 10 more minutes. Any, Hannah?
Thank you, Dima. I want you to you spoke about the intergenerational aspect of the archive so beautifully. I want you to speak about the intercommunal aspect and what it means in today's Lebanon to have migrant workers, Palestinians and Syrians and Lebanese feminists in one archive and under one umbrella.
Any other that we can take? Okay.
What does it mean? I mean, my hope is that it changes everything, not just for the feminists themselves, changes the way they think of themselves, they think of their histories, who they are, they disrupts, for Lebanese feminists, their own centrality, for example, their own maybe entitlement, if there are other stories, and if they're starting to think of the privileges, complicity, privileges and all that. But then, I mean, the more challenging issue is how does that trans-communal aspect of the archive, how does that inclusivity translate into activism, into maybe not one narrative, but sort of these interlinking narratives, and what they do in the world when the world hears them. Especially, in like a period like the last 2 weeks when, you've had an intensification, for example, or another intensification of racist discourse. So, yeah, I don't know if I can answer the question fully of what does it do. I think it's a process in the making. Always best. And that's, I mean, for me, that's the responsibility of it, and the ever-present absences of people. Like there's no way you can always. I mean, there's always communities that need to be reached, need to be talked to, and whose voices need to be heard. I mean, for me, that question is about, okay, we've collected these oral histories. What does it do for us as feminists? But what does it do for, when we use it as tools of organizing? And I don't know. That's the big question. I don't know. But hopefully, like, great things and transformative things and changing the world.
Right. Do you want to say anything, final words?
I just want to say
Please,
something because you mentioned migration, and I think the terms are important because if we, there are Palestinians who came to Germany from Lebanon with Lebanese actually in the 80s. I think what's particular about this group right now is when we're talking about forced migration, and although the other ones came within a context of war, these ones literally, made their way on foot. If we're talking and thinking what it means, the thousands of people who, I volunteered in Hamburg at the end of 2015. Every train that would arrive actually would have hundreds of people coming out of it. Every train. So count how many trains and how many people would be coming out of those trains. The majority of those were Syrians. We couldn't tell who's Palestinian. And there were Iraqis and people from Afghanistan, but the majority. So what it means and what do these contexts tell us about, people, I don't know, one way of reading it is to say people didn't want, couldn't, because it was when you talk, one woman left her daughter behind. And when I asked her why, she said, because I didn't know if I'll make it, I wanted at least someone to survive from my family. So these are the kind of choices, was a 50-50 kind of choice. And we need to ask why, why that situation, why the war, why Europe allowed that to happen. People sold everything they had, the traumas. How does that shape the kind of work we do, the kind of questions we ask, the kind of recording? These are, I think, important for this particular, to understand the context for this particular community, particular country, particular work, but also in the larger scheme of things in terms of the questions we're raising here. And hopefully, I'm hoping we can talk more about this also in the closing remarks. Because I see this as collective, we all do our own part in it, but it's not my project, nor I relate to it as such.
I like the way you widened it, and I hope these questions are asked on the European side also. All right. Now it's time to end, and I think we have a coffee break, and after that, this acceptance. Thank you to the panel.